Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast, everybody. I'm your host, retired Chief of Police Patrick Flannelly, and we've got another great guest today. Super excited about this one. And sorry, Eric, but I guess I'm super excited about all of our guests, but I'm super excited about you.
I appreciate that.
I've got Eric Miner, retired from Phoenix PD, and I'll let him introduce himself. But we've had a good conversation. We got to know each other a little bit here over the last few months, so I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And one of the things that we're going to chat about today is the 21st Century Policing Initiative and some of the discussions around how do we prepare our officers to be mentally, physically, spiritually set. Like, how do we set them up for success and not set them up for failure? And we'll weave in a few personal stories, but enough of that. Eric, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate that. This is a great opportunity. I'm very much excited as well. And what you are doing with this podcast and in general, we are both, I know, very passionately involved in supporting law enforcement, even as we are retired and separated in some sense from law enforcement. But yeah, I mean, I can start from the beginning. Early on in life, I was interested in law enforcement. And I know that's not the only thing that drives this podcast or myself, but early on, I was involved, or at least interested in law enforcement. My dad was a reserve sheriff's deputy with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Did that for a few years, and I know he says many times he wished he would have stayed with the profession. And then I had an uncle, his older brother, who was with Oakland PD for several years, and then went to the Drug Enforcement Administration, was there really in the early days of that organization. He had some great stories, of course, between Oakland in the late 60s and then the DEA through the 70s and 80s. He was in the Netherlands for some time and then spent a lot of his time in San Diego. But I grew up in Orange County, California. I was born and raised down there in Southern California. And law enforcement in general was, I don't remember too many of my friends talking about that or going into it, but it was an option I was going to explore. But I was fortunate to grow up in a loving family with strong values and a culture and a purpose. And I think that's what has most driven me or stayed with me throughout my life, is that adherence to knowing exactly who I am, what I'm about, and alignment with those core values and principles that I was raised. I was raised in a family of strong faith and commitment to church and community and our neighborhood. And then growing up playing sports, I had great coaches and other leaders and mentors in my life that really helped guide and mold me. And that led me, I think, to set goals early that lined up with what I thought I wanted to do and be, and more importantly, the person I wanted to be. I never really questioned my desire to graduate from high school and go to college. I didn't really know exactly what or where, but I knew that was part of the plan. And then I also knew I was going to go on a 2-year volunteer mission for my church to talk about that and serve people. And that turned out to be one of the greatest experiences of my life. Early on, went to Guatemala and learned Spanish.
Oh, wow.
It was a great opportunity. So a lot of these things, again, helped mold and guide me towards who I am today. And I tried to stick to those values. And I think that's what will bring us full circle to what we're both trying to accomplish in law enforcement today, is how to maintain balance, how to see the big picture, how to know exactly who you are and what you're about, and let those values and principles drive you. So that's a very quick snapshot of my early growing up years and youth.
So you grew up in Orange County in California. So, I'm out in the Midwest, right? That's that's a long way away from the rest of the country. California. It's like a country on its own, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. It's I've heard it referred to as the socialist
Uh,
California or any number of things, and I think it's it's a vast kingdom in a lot of ways. Where I grew up was pretty insulated. It was a brand new master plan community called Mission Viejo down in South Orange County. I know my parents struggled, and I'm sure my father stayed up late every night or stayed awake every night trying to figure out how he was going to afford that mortgage. But a lot of the reason we ended up there was we were living in Santa Ana, California, which is more North County, and they were getting ready through a couple of different programs to bus kids from my neighborhood into the inner city, what they called the inner city, kind of more of the South Los Angeles area. So my parents were concerned about that, and they looked at some options. So growing up down there is still to this day, that particular area remains fairly unchanged, fairly quiet, but California as a whole is interesting to say the least.
yeah, but if we're being honest, a lot of modern policing tactics and the professionalism of police really evolved from California, from not only Los Angeles PD, but LA County sheriffs, and then California Post. I mean, I think the rest of the country has benefited significantly from the professional development of policing in the state of California. So I only make those jokes, right, because I'm in the Midwest. I'm in flyover country. People in
Uh,
Los Angeles and New York, they sometimes forget we exist.
yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, I've come to really love Indiana and where you're from, where you live. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about California. It's important not to overlook the trends and the learning and the development that has come specifically in law enforcement. I think through the 60s and the 70s and 80s beyond, with they look at SWAT teams or gang enforcement, prison culture that comes out of the California Department of Corrections. Those things, as we learn about trends and how to combat violence and criminal activity, we owe a lot to California.
Yeah, so we had an officer on our agency that spent time in California back in the late '80s, early '90s. Worked on the crash units out there, and when he came back, it was kind of funny because he came back to our agency, and I was his FTO. Because we run. Doesn't matter who you are when you come back. We're going to run you through the program and just make sure you're squared away. So that was kind of a cool experience as a field training officer, because I think I learned more from him than he learned from me. But he was a great officer, super knowledgeable. But so anyway, so you grow up there in Orange County. So where'd you wind up going to college?
Went to Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. That was kind of always, I don't want to say the only place I was headed, but both my parents went there, and it's kind of tradition in our family. I didn't have a lot of other uh, options, or at least plans in mind of where I would go. So I remember I applied there and got in barely, even back then with my grades and test scores. But that's how I ended up there.
So before or after Steve Young?
That would have been after. I was there for the Ty Detmer years, or at
Oh,
least
nice. He was
tail end,
awesome.
if you remember those. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah, quarterback university.
I'm a Purdue graduate. I know we've talked about this, but Purdue is known as the cradle of quarterbacks. But Brigham Young has certainly produced their fair share of amazing quarterbacks. So Brigham Young, and then did you go on your mission after you were done with school, or is that during school?
Yeah, kind of a mix of both. I graduated from high school. 2 days later, I went to BYU to start a summer term. Again, based on my less than stellar grades, they said, "Hey, you're not accepted to fall with everybody else."
Let's get you a trial run.
Yeah, but if you can come to summer term and take so many credits and do okay, we'll let you in. So that worked out. I did a year there of school, and then went to Guatemala for 2 years, right in the middle of that.
Well, my trial run was called the United States Air Force for
Yes.
4 years. That was I had a little maturing to do. Uh, yeah, wasn't quite and we know a lot more about the brain than even we knew back then, right? So now we know for males that prefrontal cortex not fully developed till around age 25. In my case, I might even go 26, 27, but I eventually made it there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will say this. So one of the cool things, being in the service is I had the opportunity to travel. I did serve during non-war times, few conflicts like Panama, right after Grenada. So some of those things, were happening around the world. But I did get to travel, and I got to travel a lot through Africa. And as a 18, 19, 20-year-old from the Midwest, traveling, throughout the Middle East and really down into Africa, it really opened my eyes to how fortunate we are to live in America. And I think in today's day and age, everybody thinks the sky is falling every day, right? You get on social media, it's all bad. The world's going to end tomorrow. We think that things have never been worse, and quite frankly, the truth is that things really have never been better. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can improve upon, but I think there's a lot of doom and gloom out there that um, you know some of it's legitimate, but for the most part, I think we're doing okay.
Yeah, I would
I
agree
would
with
assume
that.
you experienced something similar in Guatemala.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Being in a foreign country with foreign people and culture and language, food, all of those things does a lot to open your eyes, especially at an early age. So, regardless of your purpose, military, mission, studies, otherwise, you are introduced to a broader context and a bigger picture. And I know that definitely molded my view moving forward and definitely inspired my love for travel, and I've been able to travel a few times since in the years to Europe and Africa and Mexico and some other places. And it always not only makes me appreciate and value other cultures and other people, opens my eyes to have a better understanding of humanity in general, if that's not too broad.
Yeah.
But to your point, I'm always grateful to come back to the U.S. I'm always grateful for what we have, and there's many things that we can fix and work on and improve upon. But man, we have it pretty nice here.
So how do you wind up at Phoenix PD? So you finish school, and is that your so you wind up somehow in Arizona?
Yes, yeah, good question. So about in the middle of high school, I decided I wanted to go to the DEA, and I knew I needed a college degree to do that. So that was part of the big drive to go to school, right? Need a college degree. I tested with them in about 97, started that process, did not get selected. So now I'm in a position where I got to figure out, this was really my main dream, was to work for the DEA just like my uncle did and what I'd planned on. And now that doesn't look like it's going to be an option, at least right away. So I thought, let me look at some options for local law enforcement, municipal law enforcement. In the meantime, do that for a few years and then see if DEA is an option again. Since I grew up in California, I knew they had a lot of good agencies down there. Started applying for, man, I went through the process for at least 6 or 8 different agencies and didn't get picked up. And there's some, I'm sure some things you can look back on politically and how they were hiring back then. But in the end, I was not as qualified or as competitive as I needed to be and did not get hired. So my there was an opportunity that I heard Phoenix was hiring a lot, and my wife at the time was from this area, and there was an opportunity for us both to come with our current jobs from where we were in Utah while we were trying to figure it out. Moved to Arizona, and I ended up testing with Scottsdale PD, Mesa PD, and Phoenix with the intent that whoever hired me first, that's where I'd go. And Phoenix hired me. So, and I'm sure we'll come back to this theme a lot during our conversation, but firm believer that everything happens for a reason. Things line up
Yep.
the way they're supposed to. And this was definitely one of those where I'm very grateful it worked out the way it did. And in 2005, about 5 years into my Phoenix PD career, reapplying and testing with the DEA, and made it all the way through the process, had an academy date at Quantico and ready to go, and just thinking about it and praying about it and pondering and everything else. I knew it was not the right decision. So told them thanks, but no thanks, and stayed with Phoenix.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that's a very common story in law enforcement, that oftentimes there is the desire to want to go work for the FBI or the DEA or even like the CIA or some of these the three-letter agencies. And even in the 90s, into the early 2000s, it is hard to fathom now, but it was so competitive to find jobs. And the great thing about that is that agencies could really pick the cream of the crop, and it's not like there's a lot of 21 and 22-year-olds that would make really good police officers, but that's also pretty young. So, and it's not a lot of life experience. And the things that we ask our police officers to do, uh, you might not be doing somebody a favor if you hire them at that age. It's almost better sometimes to say, you know what, come back in a couple years and let's start you then. Because when you're young, right, you think you know everything, but you really don't know anything. And that seasoning can be really important. So the concern is now is that the script is flipped almost entirely, in that now we have very few people, comparatively speaking, interested in joining the profession. The stories you were telling there early about, talking with your uncles and relatives and people that where there was a right, wrong, or indifferent, but there was, a love of the profession. There was maybe an over glorification of some of the things that you would do, but we kind of, these stories that we told ourselves, it was like, man, I can't wait to go do this. And but then there was the cushion there where we can temper that with with time and some life experiences. But now, yeah, geez, now nobody, people, instead of telling those stories and talking about how how much they got out of the profession, the differences that they were able to make, of course, fun stories in there. Now it's like, oh man, when you talk to seasoned officers and a lot of veterans, and this, the trend I started picking up on really about 10 years ago, that really started to worry me, because now, those of us inside the profession are no longer advocating for our family, our friends, and our loved ones to join it. Quite honestly, it's just the opposite, right? We're telling you, hey, go do anything but this, because you're going to be overworked and you're going to overstressed and underappreciated. And all of those things I think can be true in some aspects, but again, I think we all come to learn in time that we do have a tremendous amount of support, but the concern is we don't have enough people, and now we are hiring the 21 and the 22-year-old that really don't have a lot of life experience, and they've grown up in with the helicopter parents who have managed crisis, and they've done all the things for them, and while I'm not saying that we don't get really good people in the profession anymore, and we're still finding really great ones, it does give you pause and make you think about, okay, what's the next 10 years going to look like?
Yeah, that life experience is key. I found that the longer I was involved, and because of my kind of meandering path to starting in law enforcement, I began when I was 26 years old. So still young, right? But not quite that 21-year-old, with a little bit of experience out of the country and out of the home and some other things that I really feel that made a big difference. And so you're right. Now we are for people that are younger and younger. And again, the requirement is that you're at least 21 in most departments. But you think about what a 21-year-old today is compared to a 21-year-old when you and I started, when our parents' generation started. The things that they have, or more importantly, have not been through, has or can have some catastrophic consequences, unintended as they may be, on their future performance, decision making, longevity in the career. And that's not to say, as you mentioned, that some are unable or can't pull it off and adapt. Some do a great job, but overall, you're seeing a younger generation with less life experience, less exposure to hardship and trial and challenge that can shake whatever foundation they have, or an understanding of right and wrong, of the core values that we talked about, of their connection to the community, selflessness and service, all those things that drive, I think, success and longevity in law enforcement. Those very things are challenged from the beginning, and they either quit and leave early, or they follow a path where they make poor decisions and cause further jeopardy and hazard to themselves and the community.
Yeah, it's a lot of expectations that we're placing on young officers in today's environment, and it's maybe a good time to pivot and talk about why this is an important conversation. And personally for you and your own experiences, you've had a tremendous career, but it wasn't without some significant crisis incidents that you were involved in. So maybe the teaser to that is that Eric has been involved in not just one officer involved shooting, but three, and that's a lot for police officers. If you watch television, pick your favorite cop show. Officers are getting involved in at least a couple of shootings every show season, right?
Right.
Phoenix is a very large police department, a very active police department. Just so people know, I mean, I come from what they categorize a mid-size agency, and while I came very close several times to being involved in shootings, I never did have to. Now, several people that I work with have been involved in officer involved shootings, but that is it's a tremendous amount of responsibility, first and foremost, to give a young officer that kind of authority, right? And that type of responsibility when it comes to decision making, right? It's the ultimate responsibility for any officer, right? The decision to take a life or not, and what goes into that. And it's very rare. So I can't remember what the national statistics are. Last I knew, I thought it was like almost 90. It's over 99% of police officers will never fire their duty weapon in the line of duty. And again, a lot of that depends on where you're working and what your roles and your responsibilities are. Certainly there, in your role and responsibility, the likelihood of having to use force is going to be exponentially greater than somebody who's working in a rural or a small community, or even an agency that just doesn't handle a lot of calls for service. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your work journey and how you wound up with Phoenix SWAT?
Yeah, no, it's a great question on that. I started out of the academy in the Central City precinct, which is kind of the downtown area of Phoenix, and it also incorporated a big portion of the east side of Phoenix. So very active, very busy, a lot of traditional Hispanic neighborhoods, which I was already very familiar with after a mission in Guatemala. I spoke the language, a lot of love for many of those people. But they also encompass a lot of the old, rich in heritage Hispanic gang neighborhoods. So I got very involved in working with those guys and developing the intelligence and the activities of them in hope of using that or prosecuting gang crimes when they came up. It's always very particular about protecting others that can't protect themselves. And so, gang members typically thrive on bullying others and terrorizing others. And to see that happen in a neighborhood that you are attached to and spend a lot of your time in there protecting, you can start to take it personal. And some of that's okay. You got to let that drive you. But that formed I think a significant portion of my outlook on where I wanted to go in the future, and coupled with several strong mentors that I met early on in my career that were either in that position or area, and they were headed on a track. And I remember early on thinking, I want to stay in an enforcement position as long or as much as I can in this career, because that's where I felt the most impact on people's daily lives and the closest contact and impact on criminals' lives. So after spending that first 5 years in that patrol area down there, I shifted and went through the process, was selected for the gang enforcement unit. I spent about 7 years there, and really with the intent that my next stop would be special assignments unit, which is our SWAT team. And so after gang unit, went there to special assignments unit for 4 years as an officer, and later returned there as a sergeant for a couple of years. But that really shaped where I wanted to go in my career and how. So 20 of the 21 years that I spent there at Phoenix PD was in an enforcement position with either the patrol division, the gang unit, or the SWAT team. And I really enjoyed that path, and mostly, like I say, protecting the community, seeing the difference you can make in that community, but also witnessing firsthand the heroic acts, the bravery, the nobility, and the commitment to these very same principles that were demonstrated by the other officers and supervisors in those assignments.
So the what was the time frame? Yeah, we're talking probably what, 2010 time frame to 2020-ish.
Yep. Yes. So I started with Phoenix Police Department in 2000 and retired the end of 2021.
One of the things that we were chatting about, and it's probably as good a time as any to bring it up, but around the time frame of the Michael Brown incident in Ferguson, Missouri, there was a book that came out. I don't know if you read it. I read it. It's been several years since I read it, but it's called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. It was written by a New York Times writer, Rodney Balco, I think is his name, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was really kind of this discussion about the where policing had shifted in America. And I thought the book, where I have some significant philosophical differences in some of the conclusions that came out of that book. I do think that there's a lot of really good history that's documented about the evolution of policing, not just in the last 30 or 40 years, but going all the way back to the Peelian principles, to Robert Peel, bringing that that paramilitary structure to the policing organization. The Peelian principles, the core of which is the belief that the public are the police, and the police are the members of the public that are paid to take on the responsibility for public safety, enforcing community and societal norms. When policing first started in America, it's a lot different than it looked today, but if you had trouble in your neighborhood, or if you had, someone that was disruptive to a community, I don't necessarily know that people really understand how chaotic and how much injustice there was back then. Heck, just go watch The Streets in New York. That's a great movie. But but that warrior guardian discussion in that there was this public argument and debate that got started about the militarization of the police and how, in the post 9/11 era, we became too militarized. And, if I still remember, hearing discussions or people, pundits would get on television shows and they would talk about, that the police are driving tanks around, they're using militarized equipment, blah blah blah, and it was kind of frustrating. It was kind of frustrating because I think people were missing what the what the mission requirement was and how the mission had shifted for local police. And without going on too long of an explanation, I used to have these conversations with community members, and I used to do it in our Citizens Academy. But I would ask, what's the difference between America and other countries? If you think about like, some of the mass shooting incidents that we've seen in Paris and in other places, what's the response? You get a huge military response. You get the city that's locked down where you actually do have the military involved in the law enforcement operations. But in America, we've got posse comitatus, which explicitly separates the responsibility for the federal government getting involved in local law enforcement. So, in a post 9/11 world, if you have a terrorist type of incident, if you have somebody flying planes into buildings or doing crazy things, it's not like you just can't call up the Army Rangers and send them in. It doesn't work that way. And even if you could, guess how long it's going to take? They're not going to be there in an hour. Like a SWAT team, like a well-prepared, trained SWAT team, can be on site and deployed in under an hour. For a full-time unit in a large metropolitan area, probably even sooner than that. So it's the responsibilities are just so vastly different. And I mean, we could talk for hours just on this alone. But
I was just thinking that.
yeah, and again, and I know I would ask people, okay, how many people think that the police are driving tanks around? Half the class would raise their hands, and it's just like, okay, well, no, that is untrue. There's not a single tank being operated on American soil by a law enforcement agency. You may have armored vehicles that have a battering ram on it. It might look like a tank, but it's certainly not a tank. It's not an offensive weapon. We're certainly not shooting 50 caliber machine guns off of it and 105 millimeter shells or whatever they shoot off of out of an M1. But I will ask this question, so because this has happened, right? So you're the police department, and one day you get a call to respond to an area of your city where somebody has commandeered a tank and is now driving down the interstate running over cars.
Yeah.
Would anything like that ever happen in America?
Yeah, I think it has, and there's been some similar incidents, right? Whether it's a cement truck or an armored vehicle, right?
Right.
Even though they are few and far between, sometimes it happens. But this is definitely something that we could talk about for hours and hours. But I think the kind of the key takeaway for me and just thinking about that while you were speaking was that warrior versus guardian mindset. And I think the police, especially back in those days, post 9/11, own a lot of the responsibility for creating maybe a barrier or an antagonistic relationship, right? I think there was a lot of times and when you would be used to going into a certain neighborhood where most of the people did not like the police, at least what you felt on the surface, you started to take on that invading force mentality, right? And I know that was cited as one of the shortfalls, or at least the things to look at from 21st century policing, was that shift from the mindset of you are part of an invading force coming in to foreign land or somebody else's neighborhood, uh, breaking and blowing everything up and terrorizing them, at least in their words, and then leaving.
Yep.
So I think part of that was on us. Part of it was maybe we were behind in shifting, but more than anything else, I think there was a loss of perspective on what you said was the mission, right? And it's on many police cars across the nation, and that's to protect and serve. That's why we're there. We're not there to go to become millionaires. We're not there to just go to drive fast and fight people, although some people will come for that. We are there to protect those that cannot protect themselves. We're there to enforce the law, to create order so that people can live peaceably and sleep peaceably in their bed at night. And I think that's where I enjoyed, or at least got a lot of reward and satisfaction and mutual respect working in the gang community was, aside from a couple small differences, we were a lot the same. We were committed to family. We were committed to neighborhood. We were committed to being loyal to our beliefs and our reputation and respect. So there was a lot of common ground there that I felt with a lot of those guys. But the 21st century policing, I remember when it first came out and it suggested being more of a guardian rather than a warrior. Most of us thought, this is ridiculous. They don't know what we're dealing with. We're here to enforce the law and arrest people and use force. And all those things are true, but mindset and perspective are very important, powerful things. And taking some time, and especially over the years, to pause and think, listen, we are here to protect people and to take care of them and make sure that their neighborhood is safe. Now, I may not live on this block, right? And I get to go home at night, but I live in the city of Phoenix. And I hope that the police that come into my neighborhood have more of that guardian mindset, right? And it doesn't mean that guardian is soft or unaccustomed or unwilling to use violence. But in the end, there needs to be somebody there that's committed through principles and values of love and selflessness and that nobility of purpose that I still truly believe brings many to this career in law enforcement, to stand and defend those that can't defend themselves. And the more that we incorporate that and apply it and mentor and train, especially the younger officers, that lends to greater community engagement, greater trust, greater transparency, greater commitment to cooperation. So I'm not just coming in and imposing my will. I'm working with a selection of people that I've already developed a relationship with to solve a problem in their neighborhood. And many times, if not all the time, you're going to find greater success and reward, and again, longevity and resilience in that approach. Because there's only so long that you can go in thinking, right, everybody's an asshole. I'm here to kick ass and take names and just arrest everybody and leave. That's a short-term plan that leads nowhere positive. And so I think that focus on more of a guardian mindset. But it's true, like you mentioned earlier. I mean, at some point, order needs to be enforced, ultimately, and with violence. And I think it was Tim Larkin. I'll give him credit. He's a longtime self-defense instructor, and I think you and I have talked about it, right? But he always said, violence is rarely the answer, but when it is the answer, it's the only answer. So again, coming full circle to training, what we've learned in life experiences, how do we now hire the right people? How do we train them? And how do we set them out in these neighborhoods with that vast responsibility of everything from pulling a kid out of a burning car to using their gun to shoot and kill somebody that's threatening others? And how do we encourage proper decision making under stress and in critical incidents when it matters most? And so we don't lose sight of who we are and our alignment with true values and principles that will affect us in and out of the job.
Yeah. And that's not an easy balance to strike. And I think that's, the key word there is balance, in that
Balance.
you have
Yes.
you have to have a balanced approach, because in life, and like anything else, right? Once one part of your life gets out of balance, it's going to affect everything else that you're trying to do. And That's a lot of the stuff that, we've talked to on our guests for this podcast. That's really what we're seeking. What are the best practices? What are the things that we can do to not just survive this type of environment, but to thrive in it? And that guardian, that warrior mindset, it's a mistake that it's funny sometimes because we don't learn from history, and that's why I get worried in some of these today's social media discussions. I think maybe the broader one now is, Elon Musk has recently purchased Twitter, and now you've got half of the Twitter universe is concerned about getting kicked off, whereas a few years ago, you had half the Twitter, the other half complaining that, hey, we're being throttled, we're being muted, I'm not getting my chance to speak, and so even we can watch this play out, like from the sidelines, about how you just see these shift in attitudes based on how things are affecting you personally. And so if you go into these neighborhoods and you think about police, and generally what it was referred to are saturation patrols, where you would go, if you're in a high crime area or place where you've got a lot of gun violence or a lot of violence stemming from open air drug markets, the answer sometimes was not being surgical, but being, just coming in and swatting everything. And you come in like an occupying force, like you said, and you leave like an occupying force. And, everybody in that neighborhood, it feels victimized by that type of approach. If you're stopping every car, if you're questioning, if you're treating everybody in there like they're potentially a criminal, when we know that only a small percentage of those people truly are. But you affect everybody in that approach. And I think for all the good intentions that a lot of agencies had, we had some less than stellar outcomes. And the military really even learned that lesson. A few of my friends that I've talked to about this, that worked in special operations, early on, especially in Iraq, where they were identifying high value targets. They were going in and really with a big show of force, and taking over city blocks and blowing everything up, grabbing who they needed, or killing who they needed to, and then leaving, and then everybody else in that neighborhood gets affected, and it was not working well. And they the military eventually kind of came to policing and said, you know what, how do you guys do this? And so there's always been, I think, a give and take, and some good learning opportunities. But the lesson there was, well, you know what, we're creating more enemies when we go in and do that. And how about we go in and identify what our problems are, who our problem people are, and collaborate with our neighborhoods and our neighborhood leaders and those that are in there to help us identify where the problems are.
Well, and not just what we think are the problems, right?
Yes, absolutely.
What are the problems that affect them, right? And that was always a sobering realization many points, where I would think, hey, this house on the corner that is running 24/7 with gangsters coming in and out and looks like a drive-through, right? Cars pulling up, dope deals. To me, I thought this is a huge neighborhood problem, right? And then you go talk to some of the people that live there all the time, like, no, they're just doing their thing. That doesn't really bother me. What bothers me is that all the graffiti on this wall down here, or these parked abandoned cars that attract transients that live in there, and then they affect and accost my kids when they're walking to school. That's what really bothers me. So coming to that realization of, hey, we need to communicate with these people that are also invested in their neighborhood to come to common terms on, hey, what can we do to improve your quality of life here? So we're not just the occupying force that comes in and leaves everything a mess and in shambles, right? Where even people that liked us before now don't, or they distrust us. They're better off, they feel, with the people that they know in the neighborhood. That was a big transition for me.
So, well, with all that in mind, maybe this is probably as good a time as any. You said it best, and the quote that you use from Tim Larkin, I think, is exceptional because it kind of encapsulates what we ask of a police officer today. And I think sadly there's a big part of the country, or there's a lot of people in our country that would want to believe, I think the uh maybe I don't maybe it's the more enlightened side, the more compassionate, empathetic side would like to think that the police can go out and do their job and never have to use force, never have to engage in uh, any type of physical tactics to affect an arrest or to take somebody into custody. But that's just not the reality of what we deal with. And the in this big shift, this big discussion that we've had, and really since those post Ferguson days, um, what I try to explain to people is as best I can is that there is force is always the least desirable option for any police officer. But in my 27 years, I have never witnessed or had to review as an administrator any use of force that was not precipitated by verbal noncompliance, which then led to physical noncompliance. So it's kind of one of the things where policing, I think we can do a better job of educating the public, but I also think the public at large, and probably the mainstream media, this doesn't sell, it's not it's not exciting stuff, but when a police officer is engaged in an investigation, or if they have a lawful purpose to be conducting their official duties, then in most of those cases, and many of those cases, that's going to involve an arrest or any type of criminal activity where an officer has probable cause. Any case where an officer has probable cause, a person doesn't have the right to choose. They don't get to decide that, no, I'm not going to comply with you right now, I'll go to court later. That's not the way the system works. And if it did, there would be chaos, absolute chaos on the streets. So
Yeah. Oh, good.
Oh no, that's really just kind of the point that I wanted to make, and it's the when you're trying to prepare an officer, uh, it especially, and we've had some discussions on previous podcasts about how do you train an officer? What's the right time? Are we doing enough to actually adequately train and prepare officers for the things that we're asking them to do? All those things, I think, are legitimate conversations that need to be had in this environment, where if we're gonna start charging police officers for murder for using force, then we better have given them every possible opportunity to succeed, and that's through education, training, and preparedness, and quite frankly, even in screening and making sure that we're getting the right people. Because that's a game changer. And when you can't attract people of high character and integrity and high intelligence to come in and do this very demanding and questionable job, then what you're going to get eventually is the opposite. And so for people that think we have a problem now in policing, wait till where we are 5 or 10 years from now to see where the problem, what it really looks like when you don't get the right people into the profession. It's me babbling a little bit about the warrior guardian. In the end, the way I've always tried to slice that pie is just say, look, listen, you have to have the the spirit and really the heart of a guardian, but you also at the same time have to have the mindset of the warrior, and those two things can be in the same person, and when they're employed at the right time, under the right circumstances, most people get it, they understand, they see it, and they go, yep, that makes sense to me. Very,
Yeah,
very
I
few
don't think
cases of
they're
force where it's egregiously bad.
yeah, they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can still be a guardian and utilize tactics or principles or a mindset of a warrior. And even beyond that, I think a guardian alone covers that spectrum, right? We talked a little bit about it. I live in a home, I live with my family, and I am prepared to do anything necessary to protect them, including the use of deadly force, right? And that to me doesn't transcend beyond a guardian. And I think that same mindset can and should be applied in our daily law enforcement activities in the community, right? Because very few people, even if they don't like the police or don't support the police, they understand that force is necessary and it's a necessary part of maintaining order and enforcing the law and preserving the peace. It's what the expectation is and really should be is that it is the appropriate professional and necessary level of force given the circumstances. So now the question is, how do you prepare officers of any level, especially new ones, to make those decisions with that type of responsibility and authority and do it correctly, or do it not to what is pleasing to people all the time, but what is correct? And based on the circumstances, what was the appropriate level of force? And again, we could talk all day and more on escalation and de-escalation, and that's part of it, right? Am I using everything at my disposal to buy time when there is time to utilize a lesser degree of force to resolve this? And that is a desired outcome. But there's also fleeting windows of opportunity where we sometimes choose to escalate as part of de-escalation and take advantage of a small window of opportunity to use force that's still appropriate to prevent the further use of force or further harm and hazard to the community, to the officer, and to the suspect themselves. We're going to do something that keeps them from being injured to a greater level. And so I think that's something that we need to strive for. And moving forward in the evolution of law enforcement is, how do we provide that understanding and training so that officers are using appropriate force given the circumstances, but being confident to know that they're able to act when they see that window of opportunity appropriately and to protect the community and mitigate risk to everybody involved. And that's a hard or a tall order. Again, knowing the brain science and training and education, everything else that we've learned over the years, you can get close to that with a crawl, walk, run, but approach. But a lot of times, the best or only place we as law enforcement officers are going to get that required experience and understanding and context and ability to make sound decisions in critical incidents is, in fact, in those critical incidents. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate the physiological response, the stress, the time compression, all of those things, and now asking that officer to use appropriate force given the circumstances. Moving forward, that's one of our prime goals, I believe, in law enforcement. How do we teach that and train that so we have more successful, legitimate, trust-building outcomes?
And I do think technology moving forward, there are some exciting things that are on the horizon. Especially when you start talking about virtual reality and augmented reality, and I think that there's a new frontier of training, but we're still at the base level, still human beings dealing with other human beings that are very unpredictable. We're not producing widgets in public safety. We're not dealing with known quantities and known failure rates. We're dealing with subjective judgments made under extreme duress in a multitude of different environments. And quite frankly, let's just face it, 18,000 police departments in America, and 50 different states, 50 different standards, and a need that is different from community to community. So while we've gotten into some of these interesting conversations, I do think that there is a place for some standardized core set of skill sets that we should be able to train and teach and make sure we have a consistency across the country. I don't know that that's going to work. I don't know that we can scale that to every one of our 900,000 or so, give or take, police officers in America. But with that being said, so you've personally been involved in multiple encounters that involve deadly force. So what are the lessons that in the big takeaways for you personally that you think that you can share to help, number one, help people better understand the officer's perspective, and then two, how do you take what you've learned and apply that moving forward to the benefit of the officers that you're teaching and that you have the opportunity to influence in the future?
Yeah, really good questions there. And yeah, you alluded to it, but just so listeners have some context, I've been involved as a shooter in 3 critical incidents or officer-involved shootings. I've been a witness to another 6 or 8, supervised another half dozen to a dozen, and then investigated from the internal affairs aspect, 1 year of internal affairs, another half dozen officer-involved shootings. So several dozen critical incidents that involved officer-involved shootings that I've been intimately a part of. I think the primary takeaway is that we talk about training because you fall back to your level of training to whatever degree that is, given the circumstances of the critical incident. And you hope, and I was always grateful that I could do what was expected of me in that moment, and that was to defend others. And so to be able to make those decisions mostly ahead of time, right? We talk about most any tactical operations and decision making, most of those decisions are made long before the incident ever occurs. So if you have proper training, you have more importantly a proper understanding of what use of force is, when those situations arise, what lines do you draw for yourself to know, okay, we are at this threshold, this is now an option to use deadly force. So you're not second guessing or questioning yourself in the moment. And I think that was one of the greatest things that helped me to make good decisions under stress, whether I was actively behind the gun or directing the operation from a supervisory standpoint, is to be confident in my understanding of the law, of court decisions, of risk versus reward, the threat to the community and others, and then understanding of what my people and the resources were capable of in that moment. So stripping away everything that comes with how's this going to look on the news? What's the executive staff going to think? Am I going to get fired, sued? There's just no time, and there really shouldn't be that element cluttering your mind in those situations. You need to streamline and make it as clear cut as possible given the circumstances. And if force is appropriate, then use force and use it appropriately and at the right moment. Getting people to that point, training them moving forward, again, is that's the question. Whether it's virtual reality, whether it's introducing greater stress or force on force training, where we can elicit some of those psychological, physiological responses to prepare them ahead of time, right? And you and I both know and understand those are different, and why I come back many times to this overall life balance, right? How I responded and who I was in 2012 was wildly different than who I was in 2022. As a man, as an officer, as a supervisor, whatever, based on what was going on at home, in my job, in my personal life, in my professional life, that can elicit a different response. So there's an additional element of variety and variability um, in that individual, if that makes sense, right? So we don't just have
Makes perfect sense.
how that person might react in the moment, but how that person at that time might react. So training them to understand that first, right? The proper mindset ahead of time, the proper commitment to truth. And I always come back to that. Truth is truth, right is right. And when I can complete that and do that, and more importantly, I'm doing it for the mission and for others first, before myself. Many times, if not all of those times, at least in my experience, you make the best decision possible given the circumstances. And it doesn't mean somebody's not going to take days or months or years to second guess and evaluate and look at what you could have and should have done differently. I understand that, and there's lessons to be learned. But ultimately, and I think, again, even the people that are not supportive of police understand that police in today's day and age, especially, are put in a situation where they have limited information. They have a critical incident where they are threatened, the people are threatened, and it's happening right now. And you're dealing with an adversary that has a vote. You don't know what they're going to do. Our use of force and violence, if it rises to that, is always reactionary. It's not preemptive or proactive. We are always responding. And again, this is not to overlook the bad apples, however you want to categorize it. There's people that just are not a good fit for this job and should not be in this position. They've proven that they make poor decisions. Or you may have a good person that makes a poor decision. This job is not for them. But it's hard to be critical of, especially some of these younger, inexperienced officers, for doing something in a critical incident under extreme circumstances that we didn't adequately prepare and train them for. One of the shootings I was involved in, there was an officer that was immediately behind me and fired his gun at the suspect and missed me by centimeters. If you look at the video, it's amazing. I don't know how
I was just thinking about that the other day, because there was I think it was on Police One, but there was recently a video released from New York City, or maybe it was somewhere in New York. Might have been New York City. Very similar circumstances. An officer fired, two officers. There was multiple officers involved in a shooting, but one behind another, and they literally crossed in front of each other. And I
it
don't
just
know how.
happens.
Yeah,
It
it
happens. And I
does,
don't know
and
how to
it
train
happens
that,
like
right?
that.
And somebody could say, "Well, aren't you mad at him for shooting behind you and almost shooting you in the back?" I'm really glad it didn't happen, right? But how can we get upset with an officer like that when we ask them to perform at an extremely high level while only giving them the resources and training that don't match up to that for whatever reason? So it's, and that physiological response is key, right? For him, he thought he had 20 feet of clear open vision to shoot, right? In the moment, he had no idea, right, that I was there or even close to being in the way. One example I give of those differences in my 3 different shootings, you talk about auditory exclusion. First shooting, I had total auditory exclusion. The second one, I had 0. And the third one, I had it only in one ear and not the other. So I don't know how to explain it any better that those responses are different each time. So how do you anticipate and train for that? Man, I hope some people have some good answers.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether we'll ever, but it brings up a really interesting question. So, if you think about it in this context, right, and we won't even use your personal cases for discussion, but let's use the cases where everybody's very familiar of. We've seen it all in the news, but if you have the George Floyd case in Minneapolis, where you have an arrest that's gone combative, non-compliant subject. He is detained, and he's proned out, and he's in that position for an extended period of time. And then we all know the result of that. that's an example of, where a use of force incident is unfolding. And again, I've had this conversation with a few experts where I'm really curious about what the state of mind was, and the things that led up to that moment, not just from a training perspective, but for what we're trying to talk about and really educate our audience on in the Coptimizer podcast and everything that we're doing is, how do we prepare an officer to be physically and mentally and emotionally ready to do the right thing in that moment? Because you don't get the time, right? You don't get to pick the time or place or location. We've heard these analogies before about, fighters and whether it's MMA or boxers. And this example is probably good to bring up for our audience. Most of the police audience will be familiar with this, but in the policing world, where it's different than the fighter's world, is the fighter knows who their opponent's going to be. The fighter knows when the fight's going to take place. They know where it's going to take place. They'll have an opportunity to watch film and study and prepare and train and do everything they can to be ready in that moment. But their opponent also has the same opportunity. So when they both step into the ring, you don't really know what's going to happen, but you got a pretty good idea about how to prepare yourself for it. Now, in policing, we know there's going to be a day where we may have to use our firearm. It might be our handgun. It might be our rifle. We might have to use a taser. You might have to use OC spray, a baton. But we never have a choice on when it's going to happen, what the conditions are going to be like when it happens, and where it happens. It could be 20 below in the snow. It could be 100 degrees in the desert sun, right? It could be raining. You just don't know. And it doesn't change what you need to do in the moment. It just changes the environment. Where that's difficult is that how do you prepare and mentally rehearse something that you've never seen before? Well, you can't. So the answer is, well, generally, we're going to try to prepare people for as many scenarios as we can, and then hope in the moment that they make the right decision based on those circumstances. And how do we help them make the right decision? Well, we give them the right equipment. We give them the best technology. We give them sufficient time to train with those systems and to do it over and over again, because these things are all perishable skills. Just because you learn it once doesn't mean that, if I don't practice or train for 6 months, I golf a lot, right? I used to anyway. The last couple of years, I'm trying to take it up again more. But, the golfer me from my early 20s who played 300 rounds a year versus the golfer me in my mid 50s who plays 20 times a year. It's not the same thing. I know what I'm supposed to do. I know how I'm supposed to execute it, but it doesn't quite happen that way. And it's the same thing in the policing world. And that is so if you take that Minnesota case and then you compare it to the incident that happened in Columbus, Ohio, where the officer gets out of the car and within I believe it was 18 seconds, he had to make the decision to use deadly force, and not only use deadly force, but use it on a knife wielding assailant who's trying to attack and injure somebody else, and do that without injury because there's a lot of people there. And he was highly criticized by a lot of people not familiar with how difficult what he was placed in. And quite frankly, you're not going to see something where, you almost have a flawless execution of what he should have done in that moment. And he did it extremely well, but yet still got criticized by a segment of society that did think that, he should have done that. And it's like, well, again, we don't have the choice. And there's more, and it's a hard thing to say, but there's more than one right choice. There's more than one wrong choice. Um, there's a whole plethora of things that can go well. There's a whole plethora of things that can go wrong. And so if we can do our best to try to mitigate the things that can go wrong and get to the outcomes that are going to give us a chance for success, well, that's a heck of a lot more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah, well, we're definitely outcome based, and part of that's to our detriment, where we will take luck, which is always a part of this, right? Or at least in some degree we'll accept it, especially on a favorable outcome. But do we have the courage and the foresight and innovation to evaluate an incident and not just say, hey, we got lucky on that and we got a favorable outcome, let's move on and forget about it? Are we correctly debriefing and analyzing these things after the fact, right? And how are we learning from them? How do we apply this in the future? And I think whether you have a long time to size up a situation and make a plan and respond, or like you said, 18 seconds, most of that comes again before that incident ever happens. Yes, the suspect has a vote. There's a lot of a variety there and a lot of things that can go not according to plan or what we expected. And I think that's a key bridge that we need to cross is expectation, right? I saw that a lot in interviewing officers post shoot as part of that investigation, and some that had the toughest time long term dealing with it. And maybe it was not a very favorable outcome, but you hear it a lot. It was the last thing that I expected to happen today. And so if we can shift that in an appropriate manner to where these officers understand, right? Hey, and it sounds a little bit over the top, but I think if you'll stay with me, it'll not sound so much so. Hey, every shift I walk out, I'm going to get into a shooting today. I'm looking for it. I'm evaluating the environment and the people and behavior. I'm expecting that. And it's not that I'm bloodthirsty or a maniac or any of those things. But the last thing that I want is to be caught off guard, flat-footed, and to be one of those that says, this is the last thing I expected. And so with that, you can start to go down that path of visualization, of imagery, and you can start to fill in the gaps in your lack of understanding or lack of expectation long before the event occurs of what might that suspect do. And then what are my response options? And we saw that in training new supervisors to handle tactical incidents, barricades, different critical incidents, right? How do we train them when they have time to start to run through that list in their mind of all the possible suspect actions that they might take, and then to create a plan in response for that? So you have your action, reaction, and counteraction. When given the time, how do I make a plan so that when that starts to unfold in front of me, man, I've seen this already. We already have a plan in place to be able to adapt more effectively and more ably to have a favorable outcome, not just based on luck or good circumstances, but because we planned it that way. And I think there's a lot of carryover in that, whether it's tactical decision-making, operational decision-making, use of force response, all of these things. So, hey, I probably shouldn't kneel on this guy's neck for over a minute. I think we're at a point where we have some control and we can start to shift to a different plan of action. There's people around us. They're angry. They don't like us. Okay, but we can put a plan together ahead of time for things like this so we can move and have a more favorable and a more professional effective use of force that won't lead to a poor outcome.
Yeah. And what you just said a moment ago, I think for maybe people that are not familiar with law enforcement, that might like, it's not a bloodthirsty approach, but it might sound that way.
Sure.
But here's the way that I'll posit it. If you're not prepared mentally to make that decision, then you can fail through inaction as much as you can through action. And that's one of the more difficult things. Is like a lot of things in life, you can survive day to day by not making decisions. You can run a business into a ground by not making a decision, right?
Yep.
You can run a business into the ground by being too aggressive and making the wrong decisions too quickly. Experience and time oftentimes might be the difference. So here's what I would say. In that case in Ohio, it led to him making a very quick and decisive decision that was correct. That unfortunately led to a loss of life, but it also saved a life.
Yes.
And we can flip that script, and we can go to Uvalde, Texas, and we can say there was an officer, and we've talked about this, but the first officer on scene got on his radio and asked for permission, to engage a suspect, walking towards a school carrying a rifle. And we all know what happened there. That's not, and that wasn't the only failure that day, but that was the first failure. And I don't hear a lot of discussion about that. Now, I wasn't there. I don't know what the timing was. I'm just making my determination based on what I've read in publicly available statements and documents. But if I'm not prepared to do my job today, then I may only get one opportunity to take a decisive action that could save the lives of others. And if I don't take it, there can be a bad outcome. And am I going to be judged as harshly for not making the decision to use force as I am as harshly for making the decision to use force? And that is one of the most difficult things to try to get people to understand, is that you can make the right decision and have a bad outcome. You can make the wrong decision and have a good outcome. And every one of those things has to be judged. So while we're on this subject, I wrote this down because I wanted to come back to it. When you were talking about, you've had extensive experience, not just, personally being involved in them, but also as a supervisor, but then in the review of other use of forces. And one of the things that has spread through the country like wildfire, and I'm just going to lead with my own opinion, in that we're seeing these use of force community, every city's calling them something different, but you're having review boards that are coming in and doing the review of an officer's use of force. And they're putting people on these committees that have never walked in an officer's shoes. And I am adamantly opposed to anybody making a decision about what's reasonably objective from an officer's perspective, from a similarly trained officer. I would never want anyone that's not had that type of training in that background to make a decision about whether my use of force was justified or not, whether it was lawful or not lawful, whether it was within policy or not within policy.
Yeah, I definitely understand your point, but I've also seen, and it's something to consider, again, most people understand that force is necessary and will be required at some point. Most people have an understanding that somebody needs to kill this guy because he's shooting at cars right now. And so maybe I've had more favorable interactions than not with either citizen review boards. And I think you're right. There is a danger to having hand-selected citizen review boards that have a prior anti or disposition toward the police, or a lack of understanding or an agenda. But at the same time, there are many, many people that see it for what it is and are very supportive of the police, to the extent that they apologize that we had to be a part of it, and they understand why, and somebody had to do it, and they're grateful that we did it, right? So it goes both ways, and it just falls back to education and awareness, communication, and relationships, to be able to explain to even those that oppose the police, right, who will almost 201 say, look, I understand force is necessary at some point. We just ask that it's professional and reasonable and not excessive. Like, oh yeah, I understand that, and I agree with you on that. Maybe we need to talk about what's excessive, right? And
Yeah.
come to a better understanding of that. But again, it's relationships and communication and trust.
Well, part of my logic in that it's not that I don't feel like a citizen can make a good decision, but part of my logic in that is that if the citizen review board, either way, right, there's going to be a trial, most likely, right, and so there is another, uh, when you're talking about the process in which these cases will work their way through the administrative process and then the criminal review process. If an officer is found to have done something criminally wrong, then they're eventually, all right, you could be tried by a jury of your peers, and you're not getting a police officer on your jury, right? So, at least I would be shocked if you ever saw a jury that had
Yeah,
in the
highly
charging
doubtful.
of an officer. My wife recently got selected for jury duty, and it's not the first time, and she wants to do it, right? She's like, she always looks forward to this, but she gets dinged every time. So
Oh yeah,
she never gets the, which in a way is kind of unfortunate because uh, she's she's very level-headed. She has a very common sense approach, and she's very fact and policy oriented. She works in management for the company she works for, so she gets it. So I think she'd make a great juror. But
sure.
anyway, I digress. We got off track there a little bit.
No,
What's
not at all. I think it's important to talk about, right? Because we talk about moving forward in law enforcement and providing adequate training and understanding and expectations and mindset for these officers, especially when it comes to lethal force encounters. They've got to be better equipped, but also the public, and that's on us to take more of the initiative to create more awareness and education. Again, the communication relationships, so they understand what to expect. Hey, when faced with a situation like this, these are some of the options. Now, we would love to do one or two, or A or B, but the suspect's decisions and movement and his decision making took those two decisions out of our hands, and we needed to resort to the third. And most of the time, these people are very accepting of that and understanding. It's just a matter of, again, making that known.
Yeah, and that could lead to another interesting discussion, and that's, we um with the advent of body worn cameras, in addition to dash cams, there's so much video now, where the public for the first time is, in the last few years, is really starting to get a front row look at, what's involved, and it's, the technology it's freaking amazing, quite frankly. And most people don't understand that, almost every cop out there is in favor of wearing a body camera. You've got a few holdouts, people that didn't want to wear them for a variety of reasons. Some, I think, legitimate concerns about how video is going to be used and how people are going to be judged. But for the most part, the video, it solves so many problems. It answers so many questions, and it really does support the officers, which is, I think, the most critical component of it. It captures a ton of evidence.
Yeah, it's
But
definitely helped us more than it's hurt us.
yeah,
And again, that component of education and awareness and understanding on the public's part too, and with police executives, right? This is just one view. This is one version of the events. This is not always going to be a tell-all tale of exactly what happened, and we need to take that in consideration so we don't preemptively judge or decide this is a catastrophe before we put everything together. This is just one perspective, and it's limited.
it is. A camera sees what a camera sees, and that's it. It doesn't see what the officer sees. It doesn't feel what the officer feels. It's not in that moment. It's not experiencing emotions. It just is giving you a view. And that's, I try to make that point all the time. Now, the big question, and I struggled with this as a chief myself. It's how much is enough, balanced by how much is too much. Um, where do you draw the line in trying to balance the need to educate your public about what your officers are dealing with, without at the same time damaging the integrity of investigations, making sure that everybody is served their due process without invading unduly and unnecessarily the privacy of what people I believe are entitled to. Just because the police are at your neighbor's house doesn't mean that you should be entitled to go watch the video. It's just my personal opinion. Like, you shouldn't be able to just get online and watch, oh, well, I pay for those cameras through my tax dollars, so I'm going to jump on. I want to go see those videos. It's like, we're not out there dealing with people in their best moments, right? We're dealing with people in crisis when things are going bad. That's all day, every day, and so
Yeah,
I
that's a
think
tough
there's
one. I think more is usually better.
yeah,
It's taken me a long time to get to that, but again, I think we derive far greater value and trust and the transparency, not to overuse those terms, not only with the community, but internally within our department when that information is put out. And of course, we don't want to jeopardize an investigation. We don't want to jeopardize the personal safety of those involved. But a lot of times, from my personal experience, I would rather trade that out so that people have got that firsthand look sooner than later about what me or my guys faced. So they understood real quick, man, it looks like you had no choice but to use deadly force on that. Yes, correct.
yeah, and I'm not even. I mean, that certainly, but I'm even just referring to educating the public about what officers deal with on a day-to-day basis, like
Sure.
um, dealing with someone that's OD'd on heroin, and then the next call you're in somebody's house on a domestic violence situation, and then you're at a car accident where people are injured, and then
Yeah,
you're at
this
a
is one
fight
shift,
scene.
right?
Yeah, yeah, it's like you're going from call to call,
Yeah.
and you want, again, you want your public, and again, I know most places have overwhelming support for their public safety officers, but when they see an officer make a bad decision under stress, I'm trying to also educate the public that there needs to be a little of empathy and understanding for a police officer, that they might not get it right every time. They might not be perfect in their execution because they're human beings. And if we show them more of the video of what they're dealing with day to day, maybe we could start to show people that, all right, there's a lot more to this than I thought. But again,
No, that's a great point. I think
it's a balance.
the humanity of it cannot be overlooked or overstressed. The vulnerability to open up a little bit more on a personal side, right? And I think that goes back to the Guardian versus Warrior. Initially, we were very closed off, private. I don't want you to know anything about my personal life. I'm here to do a job. This is the uniform I wear. Don't ask me other questions, and I'm leaving, right?
Right.
I think that's changed a lot over time because I do want people to know, especially when it comes down to a citizen review board for a lethal force encounter. I want them to know, right? I'm a citizen of Phoenix. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I go to church. I serve in the community. I coach a soccer team. All of these things that bring back for them, especially when their decision is going to affect all of those things in my future. I want them to take into account that this isn't just some nameless, anonymous machine that is deciding whether or not to use force. It's not some robot, right? This is a person that we're dealing with. I think that empathy and humanity of it goes a long, long way.
All right, we've been chatting for a while, so let's bring this thing home.
You got it.
You made a couple of statements, when we were having our interview before we went live on the podcast, but I thought it was outstanding, and I think it would be beneficial to share that with the audience, in that, when we talk about personal responsibility, for officers, what we're really talking about are what are the core expectations that we have, and not just when it comes to lethal force, but really around how do we prepare ourselves, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, so that when we do get out there, and just like you're talking about, when we're put in these tough situations, that we can be confident in ourselves. We're confident in our training, our job knowledge, that decision making under stress. Confident that my agency is giving me everything that I need. Confident that my community is going to understand, based on the totality of the circumstances, that here's the decision I made, and why I made it. So I just stole all your thunder with what I said there, but how do you think that really affects the profession moving forward, and what do you think the future looks like? And if you could wave your magic wand right now and say, hey, this is what I think the future of policing looks like, starting at the individual level, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's not forgetting why we chose this profession. And I'm talking about the majority, not some of the anomalies, right? But what brought us here in the first place, and that is to be a part of something greater than ourselves, part of the community, of preserving order, of protecting individuals, families, defending those that cannot defend themselves, providing peace and happiness, regardless of where you live, what you look like, what color you are, what persuasion of any, none of those things matter. It's again that element of humanity and love. We talked about it, right? For me, leadership is love. This work, this profession is about love. And it really dawned on me again, and you and I have talked about it, reading a book, Stephen Pressfield's Gates of Fire. You have a longtime Spartan general who has gone years and years and made it this far in life, which is a tribute to his success in some degree, but he's battled constantly with that question of what is the opposite of fear? Because I know in fear, I cannot go and lead. I can't perform. I can't protect. What is the opposite of fear? And after all of those years, he came simply to the opposite of fear is love. And in my own experience, I've seen and decided that every decision that we make in or out of law enforcement is some semblance or on a sliding scale of those two things. It's either motivated and driven by fear or love. And the more that we realize and accept, especially in law enforcement, that we are here for love. We are going out to work every day for love. We're leading with love. And all of that love talk, all of that means is that we are being selfless. We're doing more for others before ourselves, and we're doing what's right. And that was always my expectation when I led or in my personal life. Do the right thing for the right reasons. If you can do that and you do it with selflessness and with love, you will always come out on top. You will always end up in the right position. It doesn't mean that there's might be some other outcome that doesn't land your way, but you will be able to look yourself in the mirror and know that you did the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. And I was grateful that I could be there for that. So moving forward is reminding not only the old, but the young of why you came to this profession in the first place. And that was, again, to be part of something bigger than yourself, to be a part of this noble profession that is invaluably and indefinitely committed to selflessly serving and sacrificing for others. If you can hold on to that and maintain that vision and that alignment, none of the other peripheral distraction or threat matter. Whether it's in decision making or longevity of career, you will always line up with what matters most to you. And that's selflessly serving others, and everything else, you'll fly right above those clouds. And if we can instill that and maintain that mindset as we reimagine law enforcement and the specifics or the tactics of it, the vision remains the same, the mission remains the same. And that is how we will build a culture of purpose. That's how we will build a culture that matters, how we'll keep people here longer, not just keep them in the seat, but doing more and engaging more. And inevitably that will help draw people to this profession in the future, where we're seeing a gap now where not many want to be a part of it. And I think that's because they lost sight, or we lost sight, of those very principles that matter most.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And, there was always that saying in law enforcement, right? There's never a right time to do the wrong thing.
Correct.
I used to have another one that I used to tell my recruits, right? If you never do questionable things, you never have to worry about being questioned about what you did and why you did it.
Truth is truth, right is right.
Easier said than done. Man, all I could think of when you were talking about love there is like, if I break out in song right now, love is the answer.
Do it.
Everyone's going to shut this podcast off immediately.
20 years ago, I would have run away from it, but now I embrace it.
Well,
I've nothing left.
I know what my strengths are, and singing is definitely not one of them. You can put me on a karaoke machine, and I'll run a crowd out of a room in a hurry. One of my buddies said I ruined John Bon Jovi for him. He can't hear Bon Jovi without hearing me sing this.
Yeah, it's a hard act to follow, right? But
I know. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure having you on. We're going to have to do this again. So many things that I wanted to talk about that we didn't even get into because we just so many interesting topics. So much of your personal experience that I think that you can really bring to benefit the future of policing. And what I hope that people listening to this episode get out of it is that these are complex issues that we're dealing with. We're dealing with human beings trying to make decisions under stress. You're an example of somebody that has done it and done it successfully, did it in a very busy, chaotic environment for over 20 years. So it can be done. All right. It is possible. And, you came out on the other side of it, healthy and in one piece. And that's really what we're trying to build for the future is not just, how do I survive, but how do I thrive? How do I leave my community and my department in a better place than I found it? And really appreciate your knowledge that you dropped on us today, and for sharing some of your personal story. It was awesome, man.
Hey, I'm humbled, honored by the opportunity. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. I'm out. Log into www.performance-protocol and learn more about how to bring this program to your agency and community.